Welcome to Just Think About It with Nadine and Ben. We're recording this episode on Tuesday, November 12th. Before we start our conversation, we have two key requests. First, if you're enjoying our podcast, please subscribe via Apple, Spotify, X, YouTube, or your platform of choice, and make sure to hit the like button and follow us. Second, we appreciate any kind notes and feedback and would appreciate you letting your friends know where to find us. Today, we're so excited to introduce you to Denis Houles, a successful entrepreneur, investor in the fine wine industry, and someone I'm lucky to call a friend for decades. Denis is a visionary entrepreneur in both the wine and technology sectors. As a founder of 1275 Collections, he aims to create a high-tech Swiss sanctuary for the world's greatest wines, preserving them for the benefit of future generations. Denis built his career engaging with the world's most iconic wineries and curating fine wine collections for private clients and families over 25 years. An MIT, Stanford, and McKinsey alumnus, his first venture in 2003 was Claret Club, a members-only fine wine club for influential captains of industry. In 2019, Denis founded 1275 Collections, which is basically a time capsule for the world's greatest wines as they await maturity. Based in Switzerland, 1275 pioneered the IOB, so the Internet of Bottles, I love that, technology to record the full traceability and documented provenance of every bottle in its clients' portfolios. It also acts as a custodian for collectors who can safely store their wines in Switzerland under perfect conditions and with complete peace of mind. 1275 Collections currently serves 100 clients with over 30 million euros under management, advising, discerning, clients and curating timeless collections that can be cherished through the ages and passed down as lasting legacies. Denis' ultimate ambition is to offer transparency, respect, and protection in the safekeeping of the best wines humanity ever has produced. That is such a big goal. Welcome, Denis.
Thank you very much for having me. Hi, Nadine. Hi, Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
And
Very
Denis,
well.
your current trends in your business. Ben and I were talking a little bit about your background. So, Ben, maybe you want to take away some questions we had on your background before we got into some of the key topics that we talked about on our prep call.
Yeah, when we first talked, Denis, I was very interested. I know you and Nadine went to graduate school at Stanford together, and how you get into the wine business, and maybe take us back before 1275 to the Claret Club, and like the way you entered it and what you did there.
Yes, when I started in the wine business, there were very limited amount of talent that were coming from business schools with MBAs, etc. in the wine industry. It used to be a very family-driven kind of industry, and I've really seen it over the last 40 years getting more and more sophisticated. A lot of the luxury good companies started to acquire some of the top estates, and they really upped their game over the years. 1275 is something I started when I decided that I needed to act on the entrepreneurial bug that I got at Stanford. And I was in London at the time. I was working as a management consultant and really wanted to do something in the wine industry, but I wasn't born into wine. I didn't marry into fine wine. So I needed to build my own network. And that was Claret Club. So Claret Club was basically a private members club. It was an exclusive club where I would privatize Michelin star restaurants with some great chefs that would make a dedicated menu for one top iconic estate that would come for the event. So they would send a person, either the winemaker or the winery owner. The soul of the estate will be there, and we would also have wines that were coming directly from the estate to the event. And that was a club with about 100 clients in it, and I started that in 2003, and it took me about 18 years and about 300 events to get through.
and like, what was the client acquisition of that? Like, do you find a few guys and then they bring their friends, and it just slowly builds in essence?
Yes, at the beginning it was very much organic like that. It was family and friends at the beginning, using the networks that I had from the places I worked, where my wife was working, for the Stanford, obviously, and other places. And eventually it's something that turned out to be intriguing for many, because at the time there were very few winemaker dinners. And when there were winemaker dinners, and I was in London at the time, they were made by merchants, and merchants were making winemaker dinner to sell wine. And from the get-go, I said to my clients, I'm not here to sell any wine. I don't want to be a wine merchant. I still today don't want to be a wine merchant. It's a different business model. I have nothing against wine merchants, but it's a very different business model. And I really like the idea of entertainment and the idea of creating an experience, because eventually, at some point, I'm sure we'll talk about one investment, but eventually it is a good investment because someone at some point wants to have an experience. And this experience must be the reflection of the artist, of the person that at the beginning of the life cycle of the wine created something. And that time and the alchemy of time has made it evolve. And so I really started with who are the individuals that are interested in the experience. And I couldn't think of better places than, Michelin star restaurants in London to act all these experiences. And there was immediately a very good following, because one of the things that I adore about wine is that it's a leveler. It brings people together. If we come from different industries, if we come from different backgrounds, if we have different cultures, as long as we love wine and we meet around a great bottle of wine and around a nice story that comes with wine, because wine is also being something we've been doing for 12,000 years, something that has a lot of storytelling, then immediately we're going to be able to communicate and to talk to each other. And I think that's quite unique to wine, and that's really something that I wanted to play out. And so that's what Claret Club did over almost 300 dinners.
And then so we go to 1275, and maybe we could just explain, how that transitioned into it and how you were able to then start this business of, in essence, becoming a wine portfolio manager.
Yes. So I have an anecdote about that, which was because alongside the experiences that I was organizing in London, I was also taking clients in the vineyards every now and again. And I recall a lunch that we had at Chateau Cheval Blanc. It was in the dining room of the chateau, in the private dining room. It was a small group of us, and obviously we had some fantastic wine. One of them was Cheval Blanc 1982. And one of the clients that was there with me, I had started at the time advising clients on building their wine collection and helping them as an advisor to start collecting wine and curating their portfolio. And I remember at the end of the lunch, he said, "Look, Denis, this wine is extraordinary. I want to have at least 2 cases of this, but I want that particular experience." And I surprised myself saying to him, "No, you can't have it. You just can't have it because you're nice, but the chateau doesn't have any for sale. And all the wines I could find for you would be wines that I would get from the market. And they're going to be okay, but there's always going to be a big question mark. They're never going to have the kind of light, the kind of energy, the kind of vibrancy definition that the wines we had today is going to deliver to you." And this guy didn't take it very nicely, because he was kind of like, money is no object. And usually people don't say no when I ask for things. And so I was very polite, and we're still good friends. But I said, "Look, it's great. I mean, you're a great guy. Come back and hopefully they'll open another bottle for us at the chateau. But you can't buy it." And I was thinking, it's just absurd that someone who is willing to pay whatever it takes to have the experience can't have access to the experience. And so 1275 really was born out of the seed that was planted that day. And as I was mentioning, alongside the dinners, I advised some of my friends, some of my clients to create their collection. And again, not being a wine merchant, but more an advisor and trying to understand why and how we should buy wine. And I noticed a few things, 3 things possibly. One is that commercially, there was a demand for that. I had quite a few friends that definitely had the capacity financially, but also the interest to build a wine collection, that never got around to do it because they lacked time or motivation, or because maybe they didn't trust the system. They knew that a merchant was going to sell to them something they didn't want to keep and not necessarily what they needed. And so there was definitely a commercial proposition in doing that, the same way that exists for art or other areas where people have advisors. The second thing I realized, and that's really 300 events I did with Claret Club, was the fact that the wines were different at the dinners that we organized than the very same wine, the same name and same vintage that I could have at a friend's place or in a restaurant. Why? Because the bottle has not traveled around the world 3 or 5 times. The more sought after wine is, the more it changes hands, the more it's being traded. And the way wine is traded today is extremely antiquated, and the wine travels a lot, way too much for what it is, which is food and fragile. And this difference between what I was very, very lucky to experience over these 300 dinners and the wines that I saw in the market, the same wines, really got my mind, activated. And the last one, because as I was starting to work with some clients and to start building a collection, it was friends and family at the beginning. It was an Excel spreadsheet on the side of the business that started to balloon. I realized that there was a real logistics nightmare in trying to get these wines together. Because every time you buy a wine, you need to move the wine. And again, the wine market in the value chain of wine, the logistics of wine is really the poor child in the whole value chain. And it's counterintuitive because, again, wine has become extremely precious and wine is fragile. And so why would you risk it? And so that's really the three things, sort of this commercial proposition, the fact that I got to experience the wine the way it should be, and the logistic headache that wine is for storage and transport that put together got me to create 1275.
And so now we're like thinking about this from like, you had developed the client side to the Claret Club, which is a task in itself. These are high end clients. And then you had to develop the actual networks with the wines, because like in essence, you're kind of selling scarcity, right? Experience in good wine, but it's a scarce asset, which is why it appreciates. How was it in developing that side of the business model?
For that side of the business model, I envisioned something that would be a plug and play solution for people that want to seriously collect wines, and they want to do it with zero risk, which at the time sort of didn't exist. You always wanted, to have a collection of wine, but again, you didn't know how to start. And so we kind of see ourselves as a family office for wine, if you wish, where we basically take over the full value chain. So the selection of the wine, so there's the advisory piece, the sourcing of the wine, which is critical. You mentioned scarcity. Today, it's very much of a sourcing game. Either you have access to the wine or you don't. And if you don't, then you need to get it in places where it's going to be both expensive and risky, because there's a lot of fakes out there. And the last one is the safekeeping. And that's why being in Switzerland sort of lit a bulb at some point in my head, and was thinking, well, this is a country where they know how to safekeep people's possessions, and they have a pretty good engineering culture. And so let's use that to make sure that we build the perfect place for those wines to age.
And so maybe talk to, okay, I'm a client. I come to Denis, I come to 1275.
Good.
I'm like, I want to get in the wine business. What is the value proposition to me, both economically and just as a personal thing? Like, what is your pitch in essence?
Yes, the pitch. Well, the pitch again is going to be, I'm not a wine merchant, so I'm really here to advise you, and I'm really here to listen to you. First of all, why do you want to build a collection? Is it just because you want to park some money? Is it because you enjoy wine? You want to drink wine tomorrow, or in 5 years, or in 20 years? Do you have kids? You want to build a collection for your kids? Wine is a long-term asset, which is maybe where we differentiate ourselves from some of the wine merchants or some of the investment shops. I really see it as a transgenerational kind of business. So having this conversation really helps to understand what sort of wine you should have in your portfolio. And so it's very much of a conversation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's right. And then your business model is a fee-based business model, then I take it?
Yes. So basically we have two ways of making money. The first one is a margin that we are able to take between the market price, which we're matching, try to be just below, and the price of acquisition, because we buy direct from estates. So we buy at the source, we buy like a professional buyer. So there's a bit of margin that we can take there. And then we pass on the wine to our clients at, the best market price. And the second way in which we make money is a recurring revenue, which is the management fee that we take in order to ensure the maintenance of the wine, both in terms of perfect storage, the transport of the wine under monitored conditions and the temperature controlled trucks, but also maintenance of the technology that allows for the documented traceability of the wine through time.
That's interesting. Is there a technology along that lines of like, here's a database of wines and people can access it, and we have, like in gold bars, just as an example, they have a little serial number on it. Is there something akin to that?
Well, we had to create it because, believe it or not, the wine market is a very is a very nice market. It has this very nice cachet, right? It's always friendly. You think everybody's very friendly in the wine industry. But the reality is that it was living on standards of the 20th century, not the 19th century sometimes. And given the cost of the wines, something had to change. And so the technology we've actually created and coined the term, as Nadine was mentioning earlier, IOB, Internet of Bottles, which we have trademarked. And this is basically using relatively basic technologies of GPS tracking, temperature, humidity monitoring, to make sure that we have information about every single case of wine in our ecosystem throughout the life of the wines, once they're in our ecosystem. So we pick up the wine at the source, and then we have a big database in which we collect all the data, whether it's custom information, pricing information, temperature, location, etc., so that it never goes out of our control.
And is there any scale? What's the scalability of this? Like, one of the beauties of a hedge fund model or any asset management model is, hey, I can manage a portfolio up to some level, I guess. Can't manage $1 trillion the same way, but like I can manage $1 billion the same way I can manage 50 million or 100 million. Do you have a cap on the scalability of this?
Now it's a much more scalable business than the events business. The events business, I realized that after 12, 14 events a year, it was difficult. It was difficult for me because I had to be at the event and eat and drink. But also it's difficult because the number of candidates is limited and you can't ask them to come every other week for an event. So intrinsically, an experience business is limited. For the wine business, you can buy pretty much as much as you want. And that might be the only limitation, is that if I had a hedge fund coming tomorrow and say, here's 200 million, please make me a portfolio for 200 million. Sure, you can spend 200 million in wines, but you're not going to be making the best choices beyond a certain threshold. Again, it's an access game. So there is scalability that is comfortable enough for a business like ours, like, it's 5 of us, and we definitely have a lot of runway to grow, but it's not infinite either. And that's where the large asset allocators of funds, whether it's a pension fund, a hedge fund, etc., when they start to look at wine as an asset class and they make a wine fund or any kind of wine investment vehicle, usually one of the limitations they have is the access of the wine, because then they can only access the wine in the secondary market. And for us, we religiously only buy on the primary market. And it's very important because we think it's going to be making all the difference in the end, whether you want to enjoy the wine or whether you want to resell part of your collection.
And one last thing, like, what's the typical returns over, 10, 20 years, that investors can expect? I know right now the prices have come down some, but like we could talk about that in a minute. But just what's the general return profile net of your fees that, like, you kind of seen?
I think net of fees, the literature that we have out there, and we have about 50 years of track record, talks about 8 to 9% per annum of returns. So it's a comfortable return. It's not extraordinary compared to, private equity or VC or other asset classes, but it's comfortable enough. It's more than the returns. I really like the downside protection, is that, it's never going to go to zero. There's always going to be a minimum. And so if you buy smartly, you are extremely well downside protected. But the return is about 8 to 9%. But you need to be able, again, to think of it on a long cycle. So you need to be able to be patient to enter at the right time and to exit at the right time. If you decide that you want to invest in wine and you say, I just have a 5-year window, I want to buy now and I get out in 5 years, you might get lucky, but it's not the way I would do it.
Thanks. And before we go into trends here, there's one more thing. I know that you had mentioned that your average client invests about maybe 400,000 euros, roughly. Is that true?
Yeah. We have a bit less than 100 clients at the moment, and we are above 30 million of AUM. So we have an average client at 400. We have a minimum at 100,000 euro. We do everything in Europe because most of the wine market in Europe is in Europe, obviously. And the minimum of 100,000 euro is because we want any portfolio, because they are all segregated portfolio, to be diversified. And if you want to build diversification, you want to have different formats, different vintages. It's important to have enough elbow space, hence this minimum. And yeah, as you say,
Brand, how many bottles is that, would you say?
well, it's about, the average. I mean, depending on the collection that you do. If you do a drinking collection at 100 euro per bottle, then, it's going to be, I can do the math, about, 1,000 bottles, right? If you do more investment wines, around 250, 500 per bottle, then you need to do the math, but it's basically a few hundred to a few thousand bottles in a collection. And we tend to count in cases rather than bottles.
And what is the the insurance as a percentage of the assets? Like those guys always like to take but obviously that's your one major risk, right? It's earthquake
it's a risk. It's our major cost, actually. So when we talk about our management fee, which is between 1.4 and 1.8% per annum of the value of the collection, is the market value of the collection, and that's because our biggest cost is actually the insurance. And the insurance is insurance at replacement cost. We're probably in one of the safest places in Europe, being in the free port of Geneva, but nevertheless, the insurance is quite high. And that's usually the biggest.
Trends now. So one of the things that I had found really interesting is, you've been in the business for so long. So maybe you can start off with just, overall the price of wine. Where did we come from? Where are we today? I know you had mentioned it is a good time to maybe be active in creating a portfolio. So perhaps you could walk through what's occurred and maybe why.
Yeah. If you want, maybe we can rewind a few years and, if we look back sort of around year 2000, that's really when the whole thing started. It's also interestingly when I was already quite interested in the wine industry, because I thought at the time when I was working as a young management consultant in London, I could afford the first growth, and I was thinking something is wrong because I shouldn't be able to afford those. There's very little for the world, and it really started, I would say, with the internet. The internet has been transformative for the wine industry because all of a sudden you were coming from an industry that was very opaque, which were basically run by a few people that knew each other very well, to an industry where there was a lot more transparency and price transparency in particular. So that has really helped the industry. And to give an example, the year 2000, which was a great vintage that has been very much talked about, is a vintage where, for the first time, the price of the first growth went through the psychological barrier of 100 euro per bottle. And that's really when I started to talk to some of the producers and saying, well, you're not making a wine as a commodity anymore. You're not making a consumer product anymore. You're starting to make a luxury good. And that has evolved with increasing visibility for the asset itself, more and more interest in wine. We've seen that in movies, in TV series. It started to become a sort of a sign of sophistication. I think the market broadened as well. Women increasingly developed a taste for fine wine. And I would say that it also contributed tremendously that Robert Parker, this American critic, came into the wine industry in 1982 for the first time and started to really write about wine in layman terms and really democratize a bit the access to wine. And I think it's done a wealth of good for the wine industry and for wine lovers. And so that's why around the year 2000, there was this huge increase in interest in wine. Comes 2008, 2009, just before the financial crisis, the Chinese really start to get an appetite on wine. And so those same first growth that we saw at €100 mark per bottle go through the roof and go past the €1,000 per bottle kind of mark. Sure enough, that was a bubble. The bubble burst in, 2009, 2010, which were probably the most expensive wines sold even to this day in Bordeaux. And in 10-11, the prices came down. So we're now hovering around the €300 to €500 range, again, for the first growth, just to give a bit of a marker. So to your question, yeah.
So go ahead. Yeah. So when you think about the pricing trends, and does it correlate with anything? Wealth, one may perhaps obvious, but then also worldwide demand too. If there's new categories that people, if you want to say, developing fine wine tastes, obviously that increases demand, could increase price. But what are the key drivers of these trends, would you say?
So the trend in wine appreciation is very simple. As an engineer by training, I love simple stuff. They tend to work well. It's basically increasingly growing demand because there's more and more millionaires that are being pumped out of the system every day, for better or for worse, but that's the way the world goes. And they all want to have access to the same stuff. And those wines are very good, quick way to, buy yourself some sophistication. And the supply is decreasing. It's decreasing for different reasons. First, because when wine is out, it's being drunk, so it's naturally depleting stock. But also because the estates themselves have really increased their yields over the years and are now making much less of the same wine, but at a much higher price point. So overall, they're better off, but they're making less of it. And then there's another thing which is coming, which is climate change, which is also going to contribute to the depressed supply of wine. So all these things put together, the mechanic has just been pushing on long-term trends, the price is up.
Let's focus on the environmental for a second, because there's kind of, at least from my standpoint, maybe two parts to it that we had talked about. There's the green or carbon footprint element. There's also climate change and what it does to growing grapes, right? And so perhaps you can bifurcate that, or however you view is the importance of the environmental factors on the overall industry in your business.
So the environment, in terms of being green, unfortunately, wine is a luxury good. It's heavy. It's pretty inefficient. To transport 0.75 liter of wine, which is 0.75 kilo effectively, because it's mostly water, from point A to point B, you need to pretty much carry 2 kilograms. So there's a lot of dry goods, the outer case, the glass, obviously, the cork, and that's not negotiable. So that's never going to be something that we can optimize with refills and things like that. What we've seen as a trend is definitely, in terms of the viticulture, being a lot more conscious about not using pesticides and not using synthetic products in the vineyards. So in terms of the chemistry of the winemaking, we've done tremendous efforts and tremendous improvements in the last 20, 30 years, which participated in this price increase and this quality increase overall. But always for the top chateau with this focus of, let's make sure that what we do is also sound from an ecological perspective. A, because they usually live in the vineyards, so they don't want to intoxicate themselves, as they like to say. But also because they know that their clients will not want that. And they are the forefront of agriculture in some way. Well, vines are very, very sensitive plants. And so if there's any change, it's one of the first precursors, effectively, of trends in the agricultural ecosystem. So they have been very much at the forefront of that, at the very top, at the very top end of the wine range. In terms of climate change, that's for me a separate issue. Even though the two are linked, obviously, but it's a separate issue in the sense that for us, it's almost an investment thesis. As you were saying earlier, Nadine, I think that today we are witnessing and we are enjoying and we are the beneficiaries of the best wines that humanity has ever produced. I don't think we can do any better in the names that we all know and on which we have thrown a lot of money, a lot of research, a lot of effort, a lot of love over the past decades. These wines are very expensive, but they're as good as they can get. And
But before
guess
we get in the put a pin in that, is it why are they the best we can get? Is it because that there's no more production, call it technology or improvement that you think can happen, and it's only going to get worse? Or like, why is it that you say it's the best we've ever had and made to be the best we ever will have? So kind of as on two ends, something brought you here, and then something is going to be, call it, impacting the industry. What are those drivers that are been so important going to be?
I think we're reaching the apex because what we see is that technology ratings, if you just look at ratings, for instance, we've done a study where we look at all the ratings for the last 20, 30 years. Wines are getting better. We make better wines. The climate change is helping in some regions, Switzerland being one of them. They make fantastic wines thanks to climate change because they get full maturity. Whereas 20 years ago, we didn't have enough maturity in the vines. One of the practices was actually to throw sugar in the vat in order to increase the alcohol level. Now it's pretty much a thing of the past. There's very few.
But you don't have any ski slopes, or no? I'm just kidding.
And so basically, if you add all these things together, I think that every year we're making better and better and better wine. But at the same time, when you talk to people in the industry, and I've had those conversations for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, it was a friendly conversation. 10 years ago, I started to feel that they were a bit nervous about it. And now I'm actually very cautious when I have those conversations because for some of them, it's existential. They really wonder whether their children or their grandchildren are still going to be able to make wines. Those kind of wines, the wines they love, because they see the increase in sugar levels, the increase in alcohol, which is really changing the balance of wine. And there's not much you can do to correct that. The only thing you can do is change grape varieties.
What do you do if you're noticing that and you see you want to be planning for decades? Can they do anything to plan, or even if it's changing the grape, or no? Is it just going to be that there's going to be a finite duration for what they're doing?
In the new world, one of the things that they're going to be able to do is to irrigate differently and to use all sorts of technologies to hide themselves from the sun, to put some shade, to bring water, etc. In the old world, things are a lot more rigid. In Bordeaux, in particular, for instance, they have a certain number of grape varieties that they can use. Now, interestingly, 2 years ago, they have accepted 7 new grape varieties. And interestingly, this has gone very, very quiet. But it's quite revealing because one of those grape varieties is Touriga Nacional, and Touriga Nacional is the grape of Portugal. So it gives you a direction of travel as to what they're expecting in Bordeaux. And as you were saying, these are long cycles because when you decide to change your grape varieties, you need to rip out what you have. You need to let the earth rest. You need to replant. So you're talking 10 to 15 years before you can start producing on the same plot. So you need to really anticipate today what your children are going to be basically making as wines. But in regions like Burgundy, where Pinot Noir is pretty much Pinot Noir, they can play with the clones, they can play with leaves, they can play with the way in which they deal with the vineyards, the vineyard management, as they call it. But they see the increase in alcohol levels, and there's not much they can do. They're exploring new regions. So we have wine in England now, in Sweden, that are great. They will be good. The champagne houses have bought a lot of land in England. They can't call it champagne; they call it sparkling wine. But obviously, they're thinking about the next few generations. When you're in the wine business, you need to have business plans in the decades, if not in the centuries. There's a very famous winery in the U.S. called Holland Estate, which is one of the iconic wineries. They have a 200-year business plan.
And one of the things we were talking about before today is just there's been a change in power, if you want to say, between maybe producers versus distributors, which has affected pricing. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that trend.
Yes. So I would say this trend reflects a bit the polarization that we've seen in the wine industry. At the lower end, I would say that the power still remains in the distribution. Because when you produce a wine that is either commodity or consumer good, then you're very much dependent on your supply chain. And so the distributor have the upper hand. At the very top end, which is more where I focus, interestingly, all the power is in the hands of the producers. They're the ones who can dictate how much they put into the market. They are the ones who decide on the pricing. They can also have a strong influence in the margins of the distributors, which they try to squeeze as much as possible. And so it's a very different game depending where you look at.
It's interesting that reminds me of the story of the Bulgari or the whatever the car, the Italian car is, and the guy would like interview people to see if they could buy his car or not.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you want to have a Ferrari, if you want to have a Bugatti, yeah. But also, if you have a custom Ferrari, you have to be a customer for many, many years. In the wine industry, it's the same. You have to be, again, it's access. So you have to be known in order to have access to the wines, and they want to know what you're going to be doing with the wines. They really deal with it in a very different way when they are at the very top end, because they are very much in control of their brand and of their distribution. And they usually, given the very hefty margins on which they operate, they have really acquired a lot of skills in the recent past to make sure that the brand management is done at very high standards.
Right. And just to follow up on that distribution thing, because, in America, a decent bottle of wine is probably double plus what it is in Europe. I lived in Sardinia for half the year for a long time, and it was always incredible how cheap you could get a really decent bottle, whereas, in America, that's going to be $20 or $25, where you could get it for €7 or €8. Can you maybe explain to our listeners why the difference between the markets and why, in America, decent wine is so much more expensive?
I think it's buying power, because the cost of production will not be that significantly different. The cost of producing a bottle of wine, if you take away the real estate, is $1 or $2, right? I mean, it's glass, it's fruit juice, it's a cork and a piece of paper on it. And there's a lot of wine that is being traded at this kind of price point. And most of the wines that most people drink, the 90%, are wines that are within single digits in terms of pricing. So when you make a fantastic wine that costs, much more than that, a lot of it is brand, and quite a bit of it as well can be the cost of land and basically your cost of land capital. In the US, I think that there's probably the distribution system that is probably taking a bit more of the margin. And also I think that there's a willingness in the US to spend more in wine, just because it's the socio-demographic category of drinkers, wine drinkers in the US is not probably as broad and as deep as it is in Europe. In Europe, everybody drinks wine, right? Whether you're a factory worker or white collar, you won't pay the same price for a bottle of wine possibly, but you will drink wine. Whereas in the US, it's more reserved to a category that will spend quite a bit. And
one of the other things that you had talked about was the branding per region. So obviously France has had a premium brand built over so long. And then you have Italy and Spain. So maybe talk a little bit about if you're a region or you're a country, you're thinking about branding, because now the internet, you can reach much further afield to learn about different wines and the like. What does someone do if they're making wine, or on the opposite side, researching them to understand what a good brand is, and what does it take to create a good brand?
Well, to create a good brand, if you're not part of the elite, the first thing you need to do is to make an extraordinary wine. And there's no really shortcut to that. And all the recent brands we've seen popping up in the market, they really start with a wine that is absolutely delicious and recognized as such. And then the second thing you need to show as well is consistency over time, that you are able to deliver the same quality over several vintages, and that your wine is going to have a capacity to age.
Okay.
So that's a tall order, because it means that all the investments that you're going to be pouring into your winery today are going to possibly, bear fruit in 20 or 30 years.
Mhm.
Which is why in very many cases, it's a transgenerational business where you really have to see it day one, but really starting to see the brand building over a very long period of time. Which is why when we think of the investment spectrum, for instance, the sort of brands we're looking at are brands that have a very long track record. And sure, in 20, 30 years, we might have different wines coming out of Sweden or England or new regions in Switzerland or Austria, but they're never going to have the history, and you can't buy back history. So you're going to have to wait a very long time for history to create enough credibility and depth of story in order to be able to enter the collectible category.
So I'm going to switch gears now because we talked about trends for a little bit to just making wine decisions. So you, on behalf of clients, understand their objectives and then are helping them make the decisions here. But what typically matters, let's just say that, Denis, my objective is to, make money. So let's put aside drinking because that could have personal tastes to it. What matters? One of the things you mentioned was a consistency and or ability for resale, and knowing that it's going to be good quality later. But what else matters when you're thinking about building a portfolio?
I think that the main thing you need to think about is the provenance of your wine. I think that's something that a lot of people were taking for granted, again, because of the very friendly nature of the wine industry. But documentaries like Sour Grapes and the others have really shown that at those kind of price points, there's a lot of interest from people with ill intentions to, make quick money. And so, yes, you need to have the right advisory. You need to have the right selection decisions. And those will be based on track records, on deep knowledge of the industry, of who are the movers and shakers, who is the new team in this particular chateau, how they being perceived in terms of what they're doing. And you make, again, a long-term bet. I was talking about Cheval Blanc earlier. Cheval Blanc is one of the young teams that has been in place for 15 years now. They've really turned the corner, but just now, and they've been in place for quite a long time. And now it's starting to be known. So there are very slow reaction times, and you need to be aware of that in your selection. As I was saying, provenance is absolutely paramount, and there's no way to cut around that. And then protection, safekeeping of the wine. So making sure that once you have the wines, you don't put them into your home cellar.
Right.
Because once you do that, first of all, you're going to be tempted to open the case and drink it, which is not great for resale. But you lose all track of, what the wine has been. And you label this wine as a risky case of wine because it's been out of, professional eyes, effectively. So that's one mistake that a lot of people do, is that they think that because they buy the right wines and they pay the right amount of money, they buy them maybe from good sources, but then they put it into their home cellar. And they're very disappointed when they try to resell the wines, potentially, that they don't get the sort of output that they were hoping for. As any real asset, there's a spread, and the spread is going to be very much influenced by the provenance and the storage history of the wine.
Do you make any decisions? So talk about wine portfolio manager. Nadine and I are traders and investment managers, and so one of the things we like to think about is putting some convexity in your portfolio, in the sense of something that can outperform and help you. So when you think about these younger, or you call them riskier, maybe like you guys are Silicon Valley guys, like a venture-y, like, do you have a allocation strategy of like, hey, let's have 10% of the collection, 5%, I don't know the number, to something that can give me a 20% return over the next 10 years? Like, how do you think about that in your process?
No, you can definitely, as any other asset and asset class, you can definitely play out the volatility versus the performance, and the depth of the market as well is very important. So first of all, we start to listen to what the client wants, and usually they don't want just one thing; they want a range of different things, because sometimes they want to drink some of it, and many times they want to drink some of it, if not most of it. Sometimes they want to part with money. Sometimes it's for the kids. And so all these are going to be different decisions. You're not going to be buying the same wines for kids than the wines that a client will want to drink in 5 years. It's going to be different formats, different vintages, etc., etc. So it's very much a question of listening and trying to understand what are the drivers that are going to create the natural selection. Once we have a basis of a portfolio, then we make suggestions to the client and say, look, we want to probably have, if it's an investment portfolio, sort of typical investment portfolio, we'll probably go, with a good half of, top-end Bordeaux, because that's the wines that are not necessarily going to have the best performance over time, but it's going to have a good, solid performance. But that's where you're going to have most liquidity. And it has a very deep, very well-established market where you can resell your wines. And also, that these are the wines that are going to age extremely well. So also, if you think of enjoying the wines, you want to make sure that they're going to be wines that you're going to have great pleasure with. And then if you want to have a bit more volatility and you want to experiment other things, then there are other regions that obviously you can tap into. Some of them could be Barolo, on which I have a big investment thesis, because that's going to be the Burgundy of Italy. Burgundy, obviously, we've seen some crazy prices in the back of COVID, where there was really a bubble that is just bursting as we speak in Burgundy, and probably going to keep deflating at least in 2025. And Champagne. Champagne is another one which I think is a very interesting investment, because Champagne is being drunk very often. And so the price point of Champagne can't be too speculative, because you have a real mark to market. Some of the Burgundies are sometimes changing hands without anybody opening the wines. They just think that they're going to pass it on to someone else and be the smart person making a margin in the middle. But eventually someone has to drink.
Yeah. And what about Northern California? What's your view on that market?
I love California wines, and we probably have a good 15% of our portfolio, 15-20% in California wines. I love California because obviously I spend quite a bit of time there. I think the wine have a tremendous capacity to age, and they are at a world-class level today, the very top-end wines. Again, it's a very, very polarized market. I think at the lower end or the middle end, wines are too expensive. They're expensive throughout, but at the lower end, they're definitely not great value for money. I would rather go with a more simple Bordeaux or Rhone wine than a simple California wines. But at the very top end, I think there's always going to be a market for the wines. And there's real scarcity, and there's real talent and terroir. So I think it's one of the nice bets that we like to take our clients on if they so wish.
And what about Argentina? I was at a restaurant in Miami, an Argentinian restaurant, and I was blown away at some of the prices of some of the Malbecs they had there. And I've always liked Malbec as a reasonably priced, if I'm going to go Northern California $20 bottle or Malbec $20 bottle, I found that the Malbec is better. Is that because of branding? Is that, what is your thoughts on the Argentinian market and the Malbecs?
Yeah, they probably have to put more in the bottle in order to hit a certain price point than someone who can just say Cabernet Sauvignon Napa Valley, right?
Right.
But at the same time, there's real talent there. I would be a bit more cautious in terms of investment, because I think it still has some history to write before we can look at those wines having the capacity to go through decades and through price appreciation. But for the drinkers, for the serious drinkers, for a very diverse portfolio to enjoy, absolutely. I do have plenty of Argentinian and Chilean wines at home, which I enjoy. And I do have some clients that do have relatives or family members that are from those countries, and they have some of the iconic wines from those regions, but I wouldn't put it into a plain vanilla investment portfolio.
Right. And then when you talk about allocation 15% to California, do you actively say, hey, there's a percentage max that I want by region? Because, if a lot of equity portfolio managers say, hey, this is the max I'll have of an industry or a country, do you think about it in those same terms?
Not necessarily on a single line, because every client is different. And again, we work more like like a private banker
Family
than an
office.
institutional investors. So, if a private banker has a client who wants to be 100% private equity, well, let's go 100% private equity, right? It's not necessarily what you do as an
Yeah.
institution. So we wouldn't have a cap per se. We do have ballpark figures for, again, the plain vanilla kind of investments. So someone who doesn't really have an idea and want to get started with a fairly diversified portfolio, there are a few rules of thumbs in terms of, having a almost healthy half half of the portfolio in Bordeaux, around Bordeaux, again, because of the depth of the market. And then a bit of Burgundy, a bit of Italy, a bit of Spain, a bit of US. I would keep Argentina, Chile, Portugal out of these unless they are drinkers, because the problem is that there's no market to resell the wines in if they wanted
Right.
to resell.
And so that market depth is really at the top of mind when you're making allocation decisions, really. I mean, I'm the same. Like, I'd much
No,
rather trade a
absolutely.
market that's very liquid than going into some micro cap or small cap stock with that, to make an
Yes, it's
analysis.
exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe
Okay.
we can go a little bit to your storage operation, since it's so important to what you do, is for a variety of reasons. Maybe you can describe the facility or facilities you have. Where are they? What does it look like? How do you run them? And what matters there? Because you were talking a little bit about it's so important to be managing that for a resale value or even the quality at the end for drinking.
So first of all, it's in the heart of Switzerland, and it's in central Geneva, and that's very important for all the obvious reasons that come with the name of Switzerland and Geneva, but also because it's smack in the middle of Europe. And again, we don't want the wines to trouble too much. So being in the middle of all the European vineyards make a lot of sense. And also in Switzerland, they have a very simple, well-organized bonded system to keep the wine. So the wines are kept into professional warehouses, and we have our own dedicated space there, and it's what they call under bond. Under bond means that even though it's on Swiss soil, the wines themselves are not taxed where they are. So there's no VAT, there's no duty that's being taken. So effectively, they don't belong to any country. They are there, and they are under the control of the Swiss customs. So it's a temporary place where they can stay a very long time, but it's temporary nevertheless. And the wines will be taxed at the point of consumption, where they're going to be taken out of bond in order to be consumed. So if you live in Hong Kong, if you live in the US, if you live in London, well, that's where you're going to be paying your taxes. But where we store, there's no taxes. Now, in terms of the building itself and the warehouse, now is the engineer starting to talk. I really had this dream of building the perfect place for the second life of our wine bottles, because like the three fates in the Greek mythology, what we're after is the second life of all those wine bottles, where this alchemy of transformation is happening, and it's very important to take all the measures. So it's obviously very dark. 1275, the name of the business, comes from 12 degrees, which is Celsius. So you have to tell me what it is in Fahrenheit, but 12 degrees Celsius is pretty much the ideal temperature. It's relatively cool, but it's a very good temperature for long-term storage, and 75% relative humidity. So we have those that are maintained and monitored real time. We have obviously cameras in there. We have a dedicated staff, so it's only us who have access to the premises. High security, obviously. We even have a particular machine, which I believe we are the only one to use in that particular industry, which is 0.5 ton of active charcoal, which runs every night and basically takes out any impurity, any molecule that could be in the air that could taint possibly the wine. So we have something that clears out the air on a daily basis. And we also do twice a year air analysis to make sure that our air is free of any contaminants. Again, that's something that nobody else is doing. There's plenty of other things that we do. Some of them I can tell you, some of them I can't. But we definitely take the safekeeping extremely seriously, because that's a place where the wine is going to spend an awful lot of time, right? When a bottle is going to spend 10, 20 years into one place, not moving, you want to make sure this place is the way it's meant to be. And so the idea was
Consume a bottle, right? Or a case, right? You're going to ship a case somewhere. how do you move the wine? It was interesting that you said it's taxed in the call it the destination where it's consumed. But how does someone move the wine to where they're at?
So that's the last step of our end-to-end service. Obviously, once we have the wine, the idea is to keep the wine for its maturation and its preservation. But we really want the wines to be enjoyed, and we do deliver. I think next week we have a pallet of wine going to Verbier, to a chalet. We had one going to Norway, to the south of France as well. So our clients are truly...
Just kidding.
I'm sorry?
Is one coming to my house? I was just kidding.
We could talk about it, Nadine. I think it's going to be a off-the-record conversation. But no, look, we have clients all around the world. So we've shipped to Hong Kong. We ship everywhere. We're going to ship to New York soon. The idea is that it's a segregated portfolio. So the wine is the client's wine. We are not a logistics platform. So it's not the place to come and pick up a bottle every Friday afternoon in order to have wine for the weekend. It's rather the sort of place where we're going to be shipping 5 or 10 cases, 20, 30, whatever, but like a half pallet or a pallet, so that we can ensure that the last mile is going to be done properly all the way to the final consumer. Now, when the final consumer and client receives the wine, obviously it leaves our ecosystem because there's no way for us to track what they're going to be doing with the wines beyond this point. But we are confident that what they want to do with the wine beyond this point is to enjoy it. And so obviously they don't need us. Or sometimes they do, actually, they should.
One more before we get to the technology aspect of what you do is, let's just say someone's like, well, listen, I'm not ready to spend 100,000 euros or 400,000 euros, but I just want to build my cellar, right? And obviously you're going to probably balk a little bit at that because it's going to be, who knows, the climate control, the smell, everything like that. But what are your recommendations for like the average rich folk of what they should do if they don't have a Denis working for them? What do they do?
Well, they should contact us anyway. Maybe we can have a conversation. If anything, just to give them some tips. But first of all, you need to assess how much you care about it. Because for some people, as you were saying, it's not just a question of wealth, but for some people, they just don't care about it. All they want to do is to have a bottle of cool white wine or cool champagne in the fridge. They don't really care where it comes from, etc. They're mostly going to look at the label and, So if you do care about it, then obviously you need to take it seriously. And if you want to take it seriously because it's something that you don't necessarily know, then you need someone to help you. So it could be your corner shop. It could be someone that you know within your network of friends. That have to be us. There's plenty of other people that can give you advice. But I would say take advice, because that's something you would naturally do for a lot of other things on which you're going to spend money, right? If you go on a 50K, 100K nice vacation somewhere, you're not going to book it all yourself. You're going to trust people to make sure you go to the right place, you have the right room, etc., etc. Same thing if you redecorate your house. Eventually, unless you're a specialist, you're going to take, an interior designer. Well, the same thing works with wine, right? So it's good to have advice from someone that you know, and then really push them to help you think about, why am I making those purchase decisions? Is it to drink? Is it to invest? Is it for the kids? What's the time horizon for those? And also make sure that you do it over time and not everything in one lump and then nothing. It's important to...
Just because there's new things that come on the market, or why do it over time?
Because it's a bit like private equity. It's very important to have different vintages. And because you're going to have different maturity, you may catch the market at different points of time. So if it's for enjoyment, different vintages are going to give you earlier drinking vintages and other later drinking vintages. If it's for investment, you want to enter the market at different times as well. So it's relatively complex, and it's good to do it over time and with people that you trust, and make sure that you challenge them on the provenance of their wine and on the storage of the wines, and that you basically don't compromise on that. Because whatever the exit is, you might regret it. Because if you enjoy it and you bought this bottle of wine or this case of wine that you thought about for so many years, I've seen that so often, and then they open the wine and it's spoiled because they left it into a hot cupboard. And it's heartbreaking, right? Because you have had all this anticipation, and in the end, it's a bad ending. You don't want that. For me, a bottle of wine is a promise of happiness, of a happy time that we're going to be spending together. So you want to make sure that you treat it nicely so that it delivers in the end.
And we recently had a guy on here, Tyson Hendrickson, who's doing a collection of transactions of private assets in the venture capital market. And, it's kind of a gray market. And it makes me think of yours. Like, how do we track these wines? There's different vintages. There's different areas, different, producers. And if I have some wine with you and then I sell it to some other guy, it's most likely over the counter, right? So how does someone track that? Or tell me how I think about the transparency of the value, or is it you who holds the value or understands that and then earn that spread? Or...
No, there is a benchmark, and there's a Bloomberg of wine, if you wish, that is used mostly by professionals. It's called Livex. It's based in the UK, and that gives you the standard price for a case of wine in the secondary market.
Okay.
It's a secondary market price, and obviously for us it's a bit incomplete because we want to know what the primary market valorization is, but that's something we will be working on. But at least it's a benchmark, and it's company with which we have an API so that we can update our client portfolios on a weekly basis.
Right.
There's other apps that you can use to monitor your collection if that's the question. The two apps I can think that are good for managing your home cellar are Cellar Tracker, and I think it's called Cellar Eye, another one, which is basically sort of a simple app that has been designed so that you can put in all your wines, and then it tells you where each bottle is and how much it's worth, etc., etc. Because the problem of this is that it takes a lot of data entry.
And what are you like? Let's go back to your Internet of Bottles. Tell us a little bit about that. What exactly, what's going on there at the Internet of Bottles?
So that's a big database that we built, and that's why we did a round of funding at the beginning in 2019 for this business. And the idea is to have a very solid database that knows every single step that the wine has taken since the day we lay hands on the case of wine. And so we record everything. We record all the invoices, all the customs documentation, and then we have different systems to measure temperature, humidity in different places. We have a GPS tracker every time the wines are being moved. We have our own transports. We have dedicated trucks that transport our wines to make sure that they are transported in perfect condition. So we take it very, very seriously. I'm sorry to say it's not super rocket science. So for an aeronautical engineer that I am, it's a bit sad because there are relatively simple technologies that we use. There are technologies that have been used. Basically, we look at the pharma industry and the food industry, which tend to take their transport temperatures and movements quite seriously. And we're basically trying to adopt these standards for the wine industry, because we think that given the monetary and intrinsic value of the treasures that we're handling, we should be taking, ultimate care of them.
Right. And so that there's a lot of facets to your business, and so the technology, the storage, the network, both sides. And then I guess the last thing that you would think about is how do you approach growth? As it's your business. It's fragile. You don't want to be. You got there's an art to it. Tell me how you think as a business owner how you approach growing your business.
So the round of funding that we're in is really a proof of concept for demonstrating that we can attract clients, retain clients, grow clients over time, and that we also built a bigger and bigger pipe of access to the wines that we want in our portfolios and that are obviously extremely difficult to get. The way in which I think of growth being in Switzerland and having the vision that I have for this business is really to ultimately build this sanctuary for the world's greatest wines, and to build our own facility. I think you interviewed Dave Lyons recently on flying cars and electric cars. I want to have an electric warehouse. I want to have a warehouse that is green, that is independent from the grid, and that can cool the wines without using the grid. in the most perfect conditions. And I think if there's one place that this dream can come through, it's in Switzerland. So that's what I'm, working against. That's what gets me up every morning, is to be able to build this wonderful warehouse where, there will be all these wines that will be for the future generations.
And before we go, I think that one of the things people would be interested in, since you're so knowledgeable, is maybe give us a few different price points and let folks know, like, what are things that maybe they should check out, or some of your favorites, or things that they may or may not have heard about, that they can look into, whether it's, obviously at the very high end, maybe they can't purchase it. They need to get access through you. But things that maybe they should check out if they're so interested in consuming.
I guess your audience is probably very US based, so I will try to avoid some of the US ones.
That's
all over.
So we can.
Canada, Australia, Singapore.
So we love US. I love US wines as well, and as I was saying earlier, they mature very beautifully. They tend to be more expensive wines. You're very quickly talking a few $100 if you want wines that have 20, 30 years of age. My favorite kind of wine is usually a very mature Bordeaux. I think a Bordeaux with 30, 40 years of age is just has a level of freshness and beauty that is unprecedented. In terms of price point, it depends how you choose them, but I think that, from $100 up to obviously a few hundred, now a few thousand, but I would say, $100 to $500, you can get some really interesting wines that have maturity in them. And if you don't have the wines that have the maturity, you can buy the more recent wines. As you was mentioning earlier, obviously the market now has been going through a difficult after COVID bubble crisis. So it's not necessarily a bad entry point at the moment for those wines. I love Burgundy white wines, as many people do. Again, they're the price points. If you want to go into the names that everybody knows, the Puligny Montrachet, Chassagne Montrachet, the Grand Cru, etc., you will be talking $150 to $100 plus. But interestingly, with climate change, there are some regions now around Burgundy. I'm thinking of Brie, I'm thinking of Saint-Aubin, that make wines at more accessible price points, $20, $30 a bottle, where you can find some fantastic Chardonnay that have all the hallmarks of the great Burgundies for a fraction of the price. And then the last region that I will mention maybe once again is Barolo, because I think Barolo 30 years ago was, a wine that you had to chew more than you were drinking it. And I think now it's changed quite a lot, and there are some fantastic wines to be had. There are some real treasures, both in terms of the wines and the producers that make the wine, that I know in 20 or 30 years, people are going to look in the back mirror and say, where was I? Why didn't I get those wines? Because they're going to be invaluable treasures.
Barbaresco also, or just Barolo?
Sorry? Barbaresco as well.
Barbaresco
absolutely. No, Barbaresco as well. And also, these are wines that can age effortlessly.
Yeah.
And so they are not necessarily wines for every day. You probably don't want to have a wine like that in the middle of summer. But obviously, as soon as the season turns like it does now, they're the kind of wines that are very, very comforting, and they have a range of different styles that could be really enjoyable. I have a big bottle.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And if our listeners to find you and connect with you, hear more about your work, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the best way would be to either Google 1275 Collections. The website is 1275collections.com. And they can find me there or with my name. And I'm sure that a quick Google search will be able to put us in touch.
Well, thank you so much. And I can't wait for you to come out. So please let us know when you come back out here. Thank you, Denis.
Yeah, this year. Nadine, Ben, thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Wonderful conversation.